Okay, so a kind of a raging intellectual debate amongst academics anyway in the in Europe and North America, during the 19th and 20th centuries was, you know, where are complex functions actually localized in the brain? Are they localized in the brain? Where are they found? Where's the architecture? Where's the underlying circuitry, of our cognition, our perception, our behavior? And there were these two sort of kind of extreme positions that were taken, again in the 19th and early 20th century, that still kind of color our thinking a little bit about, how the brain relates to behavior. So Franz Josef Gall is, famous for developing what's known as Phrenology, which was, the study of how different faculties, psychological abilities, were tied to very discrete, specific regions of the brain, right? And when one of those areas was particularly well developed, like you were very good at something, you had a great deal of, he had areas like charisma and, different aspects of personality, etc. Speech, actually, he had, things like that. These were in very specific locations in the brain. You can find actually these phrenology heads, these ceramic heads at, antique stores and things like that. And he had all the faculties sort of splayed out along the head. If they were exceptionally good, that region would get bigger and it would bump out part of your skull. So you could actually feel for the bumps on the head, and then get a report, a phrenology report about the faculties that you were exceptionally good at or exceptionally poor at. There were actually, it was interesting at the time, they had in the malls of the day, like Victorian arcades, in London, etc. You could go to the phrenologist and you could actually get your head examined, your skull examined, etc. I should also point out that Franz Josef Gall was also, a horrific racist, and a lot of this phrenology was used. This is a little pseudoscience-y, right? To try to justify, the horrors of enslavement, and also the genocide of Native Americans. So this is an unsavory history in terms of its application in some areas, without a doubt. Now, this was, however, also like an effort to tie very specific localized regions of the brain, right, to specific faculties. And at the other, end, we had, somebody like Pierre Florez, who was in France, who, was had the opposite view. Who basically thought, the entire brain was involved in all faculties. And he came to this conclusion partly through experiments on pigeons, very grisly experiments, it turned out, where he would take a hot poker and he would lesion, which means he basically burn like a portion of the pigeon's brain, and then he would observe. He would look for changes in behavior, and his conclusion was that it didn't matter where he poked this hot poker into the pigeon's brain. It ended up with deficits in behavior, and he couldn't really tell the difference, whether he poked it here or poked it there, and there's a whole bunch of problems with this, obviously. One, he was not very good at understanding pigeon behavior, which is actually quite complicated in some ways, and the behaviorists in the 20th century actually did a lot of work with pigeons, and pigeons can be trained to do all sorts of fascinating things and have a lot of remarkable faculties, actually. But he knew nothing about that. In addition, if you lesion, this area, and let's say the pigeon stops moving or something, well, why is the pigeon not moving? Is it because you've damaged parts of the brain that were involved in direct movement output? Did you damage parts of the brain that are involved in, the motivation for movement? Like, do I care to move? Did you damage other areas that, maybe impacted the planning, of movement, etc.? So there could be all sorts of reasons why. And plus, if you put a hot poker in here, it can cause kind of global inflammation of a pigeon's brain, for example. It can cause, impact many things, and the same thing could happen if you poked it in a different location. So this was not a very good experimental scientist, I have to tell you. But his intellectual position was that of, sort of extreme holism. The entire brain was involved in all faculties, right? And then there was John Hewling Jackson, who was a very interesting English neurologist who actually founded a journal called Brain that still exists today. And he, worked with a lot of patients who had epilepsy, including his wife, who had a form of epilepsy that we now call Jacksonian epilepsy, where you would have, it would start the seizure, the motor consequences of the seizure would start in a very specific part of the body, maybe let's say the hand on one side, and then it would move along and maybe then cross to the other side, etc. And he noted that, post-mortem, when he examined the brains, that there would be very discrete regions where the repetitive seizures that were causing these particular kinds of movements had taken place. So it seemed like very specific areas of the brain, maps basically of the body. As the seizure sort of progressed, you could see that the progression of damage in very specific places, on the contralateral or opposite side of the brain. He also worked with patients who had, for example, seizures that interrupted their ability to speak or express language. But other patients who had seizures that would, make it so they could still express language, but they couldn't comprehend language. So he was a very nuanced thinker and thought of, and sort of suggested that maybe for some of these more complicated abilities like language, the circuitry was in more than one location, that there was more than one localized region. So he was an interesting thinker. And then there is, of course, Paul Broca, who's a French neurologist, who, you may have heard of. You may have heard of something called Broca's aphasia. People have damage in an area of the left, frontal lobe called Broca's area. Many of them, not all, we'll learn, actually can have significant impacts on the expression of language, speech and sign, and writing, etc. But he saw a patient who actually was very limited in his expressive ability in terms of language. He could only utter a single syllable, and it was ton. And the way people sometimes say ton, 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 but that's not how he spoke. He was very impacted and very frustrated and very labored in terms of his expressive ability. So he would say, ton, ton. And when, he actually went to Broca, not for his language dysfunction. He'd had a stroke about, a decade earlier, and that's when that had, occurred. But he went to Broca because he had a terrible leg infection, and, we didn't have the kinds of, antibiotics available, things like that at the time. So Broca wasn't very successful, at treating his leg infection, but he was very interested in his language dysfunction. And so after this gentleman passed, Broca examined his brain and found a discrete area of damage in the left frontal lobe, this area that we now call Broca's area. And he also then, worked with many other patients who had similar language production problems, and he found that they overlapped in terms of their injury in the same region. So this had a huge impact on, the thinking of the day, because language is considered such a uniquely kind of human faculty, and here was Broca, and this got a lot of media play, tying a very human, essential human faculty to a very discrete and specific localized region of the brain. So this really promoted that sort of localized sort of approach, right, in our thinking about, the brain. Today, we have a more nuanced understanding. I think that's more along the lines of Jackson, or draws some from Jackson. The idea that for complex cognitive abilities like language, like decision making, like memory and things like that, we're going to have, distributed networks of discrete localized regions, right? So there will be discrete regions that are highly specialized. There are definitely, as Hewling Jackson sort of suggested, maps, right, of motor output and sensory input, in very discrete regions of the brain. But distributed networks of linked regions, actually we're going to see by, axons, by, the wire-like projections of nerve cells, the white matter we're going to learn, right, that connects different, localized regions into these distributed networks that are going to be involved in complex cognitive abilities. There's a wonderful neuroscientist, Stephen Coughlin, who actually has a quote about this that I think is relevant here. He wrote, "The mistake of the early localizationists is that they tried to map behaviors into single locations in the cortex, right? Any particular behavior or perception is produced by many areas located in various parts of the brain. Any given complex behavior, then, is not accomplished by a single part of the brain. So in a sense, the globalists, right, the holists, were right. The kinds of functions posited by the phrenologists are not localized to a single brain region. However, simple processes that are recruited to exercise such abilities are localized. So in this sense, the localizationists are right." We're going to be learning a lot more about these ideas and studying, some specific localized maps, for various, perceptual abilities or motor, output and things like that, and also some more complex distributed networks that are involved in, complex cognitive functions like, emotional regulation, decision making, attention, memory, and other faculties.